Yeah, as you said, I'm a postdoc in Jeff Kritschmar's lab, his cognitive anteater robotics laboratory. It's anteater because that's a mascot for UC Irvine. And I'll be talking about large-scale biologically detailed neuromorphic networks. Really, I'm going to be talking about tools, simulation tools that we're going to use to simulate these guys. And this is kind of similar to what Paul Rhodes mentioned. It's related to what Paul Rhodes mentioned about having more realistic neural mechanisms kind of in simulations and in hardware. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. All right. All right, so quick overview. I'll mention spiking neural networks, kind of a quick overview of that. Modeling spiking neural networks with Carlson, which is our spiking simulator. And then parameter tuning spiking neural networks with Carlson, which is a particular problem we ran into, and we've got a bit of a solution. So, okay, so here's just kind of a overview of why, a review of why we're all here. Remember, the brain's massively parallel. It's massively interconnected. It's very power efficient. It's got probabilistic responses, and it's fault tolerant. And it's got autonomous online learning. And it does all this with low performance components, low speed communication, and low precision synaptic connections. So, we'd like to be able to emulate some of these things, obviously. So that's kind of why we're all here, right? And as Conrad Cording mentioned yesterday, there's a bunch of different abstraction levels that we can model this at. You could kind of start out it being more theoretical, I guess. You could do Bayesian modeling, something like this, or start getting lower and lower, a little more detailed, similar to what Jeff Hawkins is doing at Numenta with HTM. We've chosen to model at the neural circuit level. Okay, so that means we're talking about point neurons, although eventually I'd like to get phenomenological descriptions of dendritic computation in there as well. But right now we just have point neurons, and we're talking about they have synapses for learning and memory storage. We have axon delays for communication, and we have neuromodulatory systems at play as well. The important point is they still retain dynamics and structure of these guys. Okay, so some of the components at the neural circuit level when you're modeling, just to keep in mind. So here's an Izikevich neuron with a voltage and an update recovery variable. Here's a few Izikevich regular spiking neuron or fast spiking neuron voltage traces. So these are the kind of things that you're going to see at our abstraction level. Here's a description of synaptic plasticity, STDP, spike time independent plasticity. And also we have a description for short-term plasticity, short-term depression, and short-term facilitation. So these are all kind of components that you'll see at this level of abstraction. Okay? So let's briefly talk about spiking neural networks. Remember that they model neuronal synaptic temporal dynamics. Okay, that's kind of the important part. We capture temporal dynamics here. And they spike only when membrane voltage exceeds the threshold, which we kind of all know. So here's a question. So why use spiking neural networks? And this is sometimes a contentious point. So we've chosen to use them because so spike events are they're rare and, in a sense, power efficient. Average brain activity is 1 to 10 hertz. Also, the event-driven nature of spiking neural networks fits well with neuromorphic hardware. So you can use stuff like address event representation to minimize communication. So that means routing spikes is a lot more energy, or a lot more efficient, a lot quicker. Also, spiking neural networks provide temporal coding mechanisms, but you can still use rate coding. Okay, and because of that, they also support biologically plausible learning rules like STDP. Okay, so these are some of the reasons we're using spiking neural networks in our simulations. Okay, so a quick point I want to make is, so here's kind of a summary of some neuromorphic hardware devices. Okay, so we have Spinnaker, and we'll hear about some of these today. So I'll be excited to hear about updates on these. But the point I'm trying to make, so we have Spinnaker and True North and some brain scales chips. And here you see their hardware description, the neuron models that they use, if they have plasticity, stuff like this. The point I want to make is that a lot of the neuron models, we're talking about spiking neurons on these too, on these hardware devices. So it's nice to be able to simulate them first. Okay, so, and also some of the programs we write will translate naturally to the hardware, okay, because they're all speaking the same spiking language, so to speak. Okay, so that's kind of to motivate in this. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the simulator itself. So it's called Carlson, and it's powered by a GPU, so to speak. So we really wrote it to be fast in GPUs. So right now it only has a single-threaded CPU implementation because we're concentrating on GPU implementation. So we just released Carlson 3.0. We worked really hard on making it user-friendly and putting a lot more documentation. For those of you who've used different simulators, it's kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes you'll get really good documentation, or sometimes you won't. And it gets a little difficult to use. So we want to make this thing usable. So it's scalable. It has a Pine-like interface. Pine is kind of like this neural scripting language that is quickly becoming kind of a standard. So it's not fully Pine compatible yet, but we're getting there. And the big point is it's highly optimized for NVIDIA GPUs. Okay, so these simulations can be much quicker than running on just the CPU alone. Okay, and it's capable of simulating biologically detailed neural models. So here's the URL, but I'll have it at the end of the talk as well. It's freely available. All right, so this is just a quick rundown of Jeff's lab and the stuff we've used Carlson in. So we've used it to build models for visual cortical processing, models that use describe neuromodulation, attention, and working memory, models of object categorization and plasticity, and then also a paper on parameter tuning, which I'll talk about a little later. So this is over 3 or 4 years we've kind of evolved in trying to use this spiking simulator, and we had a bunch of ideas that would make it better. Okay, but we've definitely used it a lot, and it's great. We think it's quite good. So a few of the newer features are some of the connectivity tools, and by connectivity I mean connecting two groups via synaptic connections, like group 1 and group 2 via synaptic connections. The idea here is we want to make it easy for the user to do relatively complex things. Now, of course, so one of the things is, so this is a kind of a receptive field. So picture these as kind of these cells connecting to a single cell in another layer, and the cell's looking back at these guys. So this is kind of like a Gaussian receptive field. And users can kind of easily generate these with 1 or 2 commands. Okay. So here's one where you have all the synaptic weights are the same, initialized within some Gaussian receptive field. Here's one where you just randomly initialize them, still within some Gaussian receptive field. And then here's one where it drops off as a Gaussian, the synaptic weight strength. Okay? So we're trying to make it so you can do more complex things and thereby capture more biological realism with this without the overhead of having to, map each synapse by hand or something like this. Okay? So another thing we worked pretty hard on are implementing plasticity mechanisms. So right here we have a bunch of different STDP curves that you can do for excitatory STDP and a bunch of different inhibitory STDP curves. Okay, some of these, a few of them aren't exactly biologically realistic, but they were easy to implement because it was just a symmetric flip of the curve. So we ended up including them as well. But the important part is, so STDP is something that we're still not exactly sure how to use, right? As people are doing neuromorphic engineering or computational neuroscientists. So it's important to be able to tune these parameters and play with them and try them out in your network. Okay, so we wanted to include a lot of different versions of this. We also have a model for short-term plasticity, right? So short-term facilitation and short-term depression. Also, which I haven't included on the slide, but we have a model of synaptic scaling, of a homeostatic mechanism that helps stabilize STDP. So this is actually important when you try to use these spiking neural networks and you put plasticity in. You could try to get balanced STDP, but sometimes it doesn't work so well. So we have a model for homeostatic synaptic scaling that really helps a lot. We also have a model for dopamine modulated STDP. So now we're starting to get the influence of neuromodulators on these learning roles. So again, we're trying to put in more biologically realistic components to experiment with. Okay. And finally, we included a nice visualization toolkit. So we have a bunch of it's called the Offline Analysis Toolbox, And it's pretty much a collection of MATLAB scripts, okay, that Carlson can use whenever a user generates spike data or connection weight data. You can just run a few commands and it'll generate something like this this raster plot here. Okay, so here's time and then the neuron ID, and then you could do it in any way you want. So here's the same data visualized as just a histogram, okay, average firing rate over time. And you can do heat maps or flow fields and stuff like this. So we really want to make it so that if you're a beginner to doing spiking neural network simulations, you can kind of get up and running with minimal effort. Okay, and here's just a quick comparison of our spiking simulator. I know it's really small, but I can describe it pretty easily. So here's Carlson 3.0. The X's say that indicate that the feature is implemented. The slashes means it's almost half implemented, and then the gaps mean there's no implementation yet. So some other simulators worth comparing against. I've listed here. Brian's a good one. Nango, and then Nest. And some of these are quite old. I know Nest has been going for quite a while. But some of the things where our simulator, I guess, stands out a little bit is where we have a little bit more realistic plasticity involved here. We have a little bit nicer tools. We have, like I said, we have this visualization tool. We also have our parameter tuning interface, which I'll talk about a little later. The big point is we have a GPU implementation right now. We have a partial implementation of a multi-GPU, which means we can run across GPU cards, but only on the same machine. Okay, so we're trying to move to something where you can do multi-GPU across many machines. It's worth pointing out that NCS 6 is the only simulator right now that can publicly available simulator that can do multi-GPU and multi-CPU. But overall, we think we compare favorably. So real quick note on the benchmarking. So to do benchmarking, we made an 80-20 network, and then another 10% of the neurons were Poisson spike generators. And we included SCDP in this kind of 80-20 network because we wanted to include the overhead of the memory and computation of plasticity. Okay, so to accurately benchmark it, we wanted to include that. And then we varied the number of synapses per neuron from 100 to 300. Okay, and those are these lines right here. Okay, so n of 100 is 100 synapses per neuron. So this top graph is the execution time divided by simulation time. The higher it gets, the worse it is. The dotted line is real time. Okay, so as you can see right now, right now with all these plasticity mechanisms and stuff like that, we can only do 50,000 neurons in real time. Okay, so obviously that's something where neuromorphic hardware would come in, and it'd be great to be able to simulate a lot more in real time. Although we can move it up with doing multi-GPU as well. Another nice graph is so here's the number of neurons we're simulating, and then here's the speed up compared to a single-threaded CPU implementation. Okay, so you can see that when you have about 250,000 neurons with about 300 synapses per neuron, you get a speed up of about 60 or 65x, which is pretty good. So this allows you to run some pretty big simulations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the automated parameter tuning framework that we have in Carlson. So this came out of work we were doing when we kept building more and more complex spiking neural networks. And when we include recurrent connections or interesting plasticity rules, it became really difficult to tune. Okay, so you do all your research and flip the switch and either get something that's comatose and completely silent, or something that's very high firing and not realistic at all. So they fire at 400 hertz. So it's really hard to get the sweet spot for these things. So what we're doing is leveraging evolutionary algorithms and our GPU calculations. And we're using a program called Evolutionary Computations in Java, called ECJ. And this is in collaboration with George Mason University. So they're helping us build this kind of interface. So what we really have here, and this is all available in 3.0. So the way this is set up is, here's ECJ, which is just running sequentially, right? And it does the evolutionary algorithm component. Okay, so it's going to, do the selection, replication, and mutations. And it selects the parameters. And let's say we're going to tune 5 individuals per generation. Okay, so those 5 individuals, each individual is a spiky neural network. So the idea is we'll take the parameter values from ECJ and then plug them into Carlson. And Carlson is the thing that evaluates the objective function or the fitness function. Okay, and that's usually the most expensive component of evolutionary algorithms. So this part is in Java, and it's not exactly meant to be super fast, but it doesn't need to be because it's a very small percentage of the time of the simulation. Okay, so Carlson evaluates the fitness and then returns the fitness values back to ECJ, and then it could go to the next generation. Okay, so this is nice because this is all these spiky neural networks here are evaluated in parallel on the GPU, so you can get a really nice speed up. But one major question you may be wondering is, okay, what are you going to use for the fitness function? Okay, right? Because that's the most important component here. So we wanted to make sure to avoid tuning in an arbitrary way. So we're trying to tune based on the efficient coding hypothesis, okay, which is an information theoretic. So the idea is you want to reduce redundancy. You want to have responses that are independent or decorrelated. And the stimulus it should be represented by a sparse representation. Okay, so pretty much part of the fitness function of these guys is evaluated based on these information theoretics. So high fitness networks will have these characteristics, and low fitness networks won't. Okay, now it's important to note that depending upon the model that you're tuning, you probably also have an additional thing trying to fit it to data, an additional component that fits it to data. Okay? So we used this to tune a toy network that was kind of just a proof of concept, and it was just a vision model that went from LGN to V1, and we're giving it sinusoidal gratings, kind of. And what we were tuning is these STDP parameters. So we're actually tuning the learning parameters. Okay? So the performance on this, so we had 10 spiky neural networks in parallel, although we experimented with 40 in parallel. So this thing ran for 287 generations in 127 hours, and it ran on a single NVIDIA Tesla M2090, which now is a really outdated card compared to what we have now. I mean, we have a card with 5 times more cores on it now. And so here's what the fitness looks like. So this thing slowly got more fit over the generations, and it was about 80%. Its final at about 150 or 200. So it was evolving. And we also have a graph here about the speed up. We did this doing it on CPU mode too. And of course, the larger the spiky neural networks were, and the more you ran at the same time, which is on this axis. So if you ran 30 and they were 4,000, then you had about a 65 times speed up versus a CPU implementation of this. Okay? So we're really happy with how that worked out. And what we were tuning, like I said, is this actual synaptic plasticity parameters. So what I'll show you is just kind of the end response here, and we had these. This is kind of, you're looking at receptive fields from V1, okay, and this is for a high fitness network. So we had almost about 3,000 networks at the end there, and we had about 200 of them that were fit, so to speak. And this is what the weights look like from a V1 type neuron looking back at these LGN neurons, okay, and they're pretty much Gabor filters, like they should be, so to speak. Okay? So this was just a proof of concept to show that this thing works. So to wrap things up, large-scale, complex, realistic brain simulations are necessary, and for neuromorphic engineering and for computational neuroscience. Okay, so to address the challenge, we propose an approach that leverages optimization capabilities of evolutionary computation, and it takes advantage of the parallel nature of GPUs as well. And real quick, I want to mention, so this is Jeff's lab. Mike Baylor and myself and Ting Chow all wrote, we've been the ones maintaining Carlson and adding fun stuff to it. Our tuning framework is in collaboration with George Mason University, and we're supported by the National Science Foundation, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity, and then Qualcomm as well. All right, thanks a lot. I'll take any questions.
Yeah, this is on. So your fitness criteria was to basically find a good sparse representation or a good predictive coding model. Mm-hmm. And in a non-spiking network, you know learning rules that will accomplish that. And there has been some work with spiking, like SailNet, for example. Mm. So I'm just wondering, have you tried maybe a more theoretically motivated approach? I mean, there are learning rules that should, I realize you have Ezekievich neurons and it's a little more complicated with STDP, but it should be possible to start with a learning rule that you know will produce a sparse representation and then maybe figure out how to get STDP.
That's not a bad question. Yeah, sure. So initially when we started doing this, this fitness function was completely ad hoc. It was, I pretty much came to Jeff and I said, oh, I had to put this component in because it was firing too much. And then I had to put this component in because all the neurons were firing for encoding for one pattern. So we said, hey, wait a second, this looks just like this. I was reading about the efficient coding hypothesis. Why don't we see if this maps to that? So we started with that, and then lately I've been trying to formalize that even more with a little bit more math, and then choosing algorithms a priori that would be like that. So that's kind of the next step. So I've definitely considered it, and I'm still working on it. Right now I'm working on formalizing a little bit more, and then trying it on a little more realistic simulation, which would be maybe the dentate gyrus or CA3 in the
It's like you're going to discover the Baldwin effect, right? That
you're
going to find the meta parameter that will allow the system to learn more.
Right, and that's one of the interesting points, is that we're not, so there's two different types of encoding when you do evolutionary algorithms. One of them is direct encoding, where the genotype maps directly to the phenotype. So that'd be like mapping the weights directly. And this is indirect encoding, which is a little more interesting, and it could be more powerful. So we're just choosing exactly these right meta parameters. And so we tune the STDP, but we also turn the homeostatic parameters as well, which I thought was really interesting. Great question, though. Go ahead.
So you say that it supports dopamine modulated STDP.
Yeah.
Is it capable of modulating past STDP events with future dopamine signals?
You said past dopamine events
to create traces that are modulated by dopamine signals.
Yeah. So So I don't know if you've read the solving the distal work problem by Ezekievich. We implemented that model pretty much. So it should be able to handle that. So that's a good question. So yeah. In fact, we have a researcher working on that right now. Jeff does cognitive robotics, so it's actually in a robot right now, and we're working on making sure it actually works. So great question. Okay, cool. That's it.
Thank Chris again.